Alright, picture a medieval knight. You're probably thinking of shining armor, epic quests, and unwavering honor, right? Well, toss that image into the nearest moat. For every tale of valor, there's another story of spectacular foolishness that sounds too absurd to be true. We're about to explore 44 times these legendary warriors were less heroic champion and more walking disaster with a sword. History is about to get a whole lot weirder. 1. The decision-making process at the Battle of Crusade got weird when King John of Bohemia, who was completely blind, decided he absolutely had to get in on the action. Instead of, say, offering moral support from a safe distance, he cooked up a plan so baffling it belongs in a comedy. He told his best knights to literally tie their horses to his and drag him into the chaos so he could swing his sword around. You have to imagine the hesitation from his men. So, just to be clear, Your Majesty, you want us to form a three-legged race of certain doom and ride into a wall of sharp objects? It was a plan with a 100% chance of failure, and it delivered spectacularly. 2. One of the most bizarre chapters in chivalry was written by a German knight named Ulrich von Liechtenstein, who woke up one day and decided his true calling was to travel the countryside disguised as the goddess Venus. This wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. For a whole month, this heavily armored man paraded around in goddess drag, challenging every knight he encountered to a joust. Imagine being a regular knight, minding your own business, when a figure looking like a linebacker in a ball gown rides up and challenges you to a duel for the honor of, well, themselves. It was the medieval equivalent of a bizarre one-man traveling circus, and it proves that for the honor of my lady could mean some very, very strange things. 3. In 14th century France, the justice system briefly turned into a cartoon, with a case involving a knight named Robert Macaire and a very persistent dog. After Macaire's rival was found murdered, the victim's dog was the only witness, and it would not stop barking at Macaire. The king, instead of dismissing the case, ordered a trial by combat. So, a grown man in armor had to legally fight a dog in front of a crowd. The knight had a club, the dog had righteous fury. The fight began, and the dog, being quicker and arguably smarter, dodged the knight and went straight for his throat, pinning him. Defeated by a mid-sized canine, the knight confessed everything. The dog basically lawyered him into a corner and won. 4. Someone in the medieval world looked at jousting, a sport that already involved charging at someone with a giant stick on a massive horse, and thought, you know what this needs? A treacherous, slippery floor. So began the tradition of jousting on frozen lakes. It combined all the usual risks of being knocked into next Tuesday with the added slapstick potential of your warhorse doing an accidental figure skating routine. One moment you're a fearsome warrior, the next you're sliding uncontrollably across a patch of ice, watching your own horse spin out in the opposite direction. It was a guaranteed spectacle of clanging armor, confused horses, and knights realizing too late that chivalry and ice physics do not mix well. 5. Knights were the original fashion victims, and nowhere was this more obvious than with their shoes. The trendiest footwear, called poulain, featured absurdly long, pointed toes that curled up for feet. They were completely impractical, a tripping hazard on a good day. But when a battle started, this fashion statement turned into a serious liability. You can't exactly charge the enemy when your own shoes are trying to defeat you first. Their solution was brilliantly dumb. They would carry axes specifically to hack off the pointy tips of their own fancy shoes right before a fight. Imagine spending a fortune on shoes just to perform emergency amputations on them in a field. 6. There are few things more embarrassing than being a group of elite, heavily armored knights who get completely outsmarted by lunch. A formidable force of French knights was certain they could crush a simple English supply convoy. There was just one problem. That convoy was heavily guarded and carrying a shipment of herring. The English archers, using their herring wagons as a makeshift fortress, proceeded to absolutely humiliate the charging knights. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a legendary fail. These knights had to ride home knowing they were beaten by a bunch of guys whose primary mission that day was protecting salted fish. That's a stain on your chivalric reputation that never washes out. 7. The image of a knight in shining armor is majestic, but the reality was far less glamorous, especially when it came to bathroom breaks. A full suit of plate armor was a complex metal cage with 0 convenient exits. If a knight had to answer nature's call during a long march or in the heat of battle, he didn't have many options. He couldn't just call a timeout and spend 20 minutes unbuckling everything. So, the solution was often to just go inside the armor. That heroic figure on the battlefield was often dealing with his own personal, steamy, and very uncomfortable situation. It was less a suit of armor and more a wearable human terrarium of bad decisions. 8. Medieval feasts were all about showing off, and knights took it to the next level with something called the vow of the pheasant. They would roast a pheasant, redress it in its own feathers to look alive, and then use it as a prop for making the most ridiculous promises imaginable. One by one, knights would place a hand on this cooked bird and swear a dramatic oath in front of everyone. We're talking vows like, "I swear on this delicious fowl to wear a blindfold every Tuesday until we win the war." It was a mix of intense peer pressure and dinner theater, where the main course could lock you into a months-long, utterly nonsensical quest, all because you wanted to look cool in front of your friends. 9. At the famous Battle of Agincourt, the French knights had every advantage: numbers, heavy armor, and supreme confidence. The English had mud. A lot of mud. After a night of heavy rain, the battlefield was a soupy mess. The French, seeing this, decided the most logical course of action was to charge straight through it on foot, wearing the heaviest armor they owned. They became human lawn darts plunging into a swamp. Instead of a glorious charge, it was the world's most depressing mud run, with knights sinking up to their knees, getting stuck, and just sort of falling over. The English archers barely had to do anything but watch as France's finest warriors were defeated by gravity and bad weather. 10. You might think a knight's main job in battle was to, win the battle. But for many, the actual strategic plan took a back seat to a much more important activity: shopping for rich people. Instead of fighting as a cohesive unit, knights would often break formation and go rogue, scanning the enemy ranks for nobles wearing the fanciest armor. Capturing a wealthy lord for ransom was far more profitable than just winning. It turned the battlefield into a chaotic marketplace where knights were basically bounty hunters looking for the biggest prize. Imagine a general trying to command an army where his best soldiers are ignoring orders to chase after some guy with a particularly shiny helmet. 11. During a truce in the 100 Years' War, a group of knights found themselves facing their greatest enemy yet: boredom. With no battles to fight, they were getting restless. So they came up with a solution. 30 knights from the French side and 30 from the English side agreed to have a massive, prearranged brawl just for the fun of it. This wasn't a strategic move. It was literally a scheduled playdate with swords to alleviate their boredom. They set up stands for spectators and everything. It was the medieval equivalent of organizing a pickup game of basketball, except the game involved a lot more clanging, shouting, and questionable life choices, all because they had nothing better to do that afternoon. 12. A knight in full plate armor was a walking tank, nearly unstoppable on the battlefield. But that same suit of armor had a ridiculous design flaw. It was terrible against puddles. If a knight tripped and fell on his back, especially in even a few inches of water, he was in serious trouble. The sheer weight and awkwardness of the armor made it nearly impossible to get up. He was like an overturned turtle with no one to help him. More than a few heavily armored warriors met a deeply unheroic end by essentially losing a fight with a small stream. All that training, all that expensive gear, all foiled by a bit of shallow water and a clumsy misstep. 13. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to be a grand expedition to the Holy Land, but the Crusaders got a little sidetracked. They were short on cash, and their ships were owned by the Venetians, who wanted to be paid. So they came up with a new plan. Instead of going to Jerusalem, they would just go sack the biggest and richest Christian city in the world, Constantinople. It's like ordering a pizza and then robbing the delivery guy because you forgot your wallet. These knights, supposedly on a holy mission, ended up ransacking their own allies, all because their financing fell through. It remains one of history's most spectacular examples of a group project going completely off the rails. 14. For a medieval knight, showing up to a tournament was all about the drip. You had to have the most elaborate, custom-engraved, and ridiculously expensive armor to show everyone you were a big deal. The problem was, this gear cost a fortune. Some knights would literally sell their family's land or mortgage their entire estate just to afford a single suit of high-end tournament armor. And then they'd ride into their first joust, get knocked off their horse in about 5 seconds, and be left with a massive dent in their new helmet and a lifetime of debt. It was the ultimate form of flexing, followed by the ultimate financial faceplant. 15. A knight's helmet was a key piece of defensive gear, but it was also a place to display personal flair. And the most popular fashion accessory was a favor from a lady, which was often a piece of her clothing. This could be a simple ribbon or a scarf, but sometimes it was, to put it delicately, one of her undergarments. Knights would proudly tie their lady's garter or another piece of her wardrobe to their helmet and ride into battle, believing it brought them good luck. So, amidst the chaos of a medieval fight, you'd have these fearsome warriors charging in with what was essentially a piece of laundry flapping from their heads. It was romantic, sure, but also deeply weird. 16. To a knight, his warhorse was everything. It was his status symbol, his weapon, and his ride. He loved his horse so much, in fact, that he often refused to get off it, even when it made absolutely no sense. Generals would order knights to dismount to fight in dense forests or on steep hills, where horses were completely useless. But the knights, insulted by the very idea of fighting on foot like a common peasant, would often refuse. They would rather charge into a forest full of trees or up a rocky slope on horseback, completely negating their effectiveness, than suffer the indignity of walking. Their pride in being cavalry directly led to countless avoidable and clumsy defeats. 17. Teamwork in a medieval army was always a fragile concept, mostly because every knight was convinced he was the star of the show. While commanders were busy trying to implement actual strategy, some knights would suffer from a severe case of main character syndrome. Seeing a chance for personal glory, they would completely ignore their orders, break formation, and launch a solo charge straight at the enemy. It was the 14th century equivalent of shouting your own name and running into a room full of opponents in a team game. It rarely worked, often got them and their comrades into a massive mess, and proved that a knight's ego was often a more dangerous weapon than his sword. 18. Getting wounded in the Middle Ages was bad, but the cure was often so much worse. Knightly medical knowledge was a bizarre cocktail of superstition and terrible ideas. For instance, a common treatment for a deep gash was to stuff it full of cobwebs and dried animal dung. Someone, somewhere, decided that the best way to fight an infection was to introduce a whole new ecosystem of filth directly into the wound. You have to wonder about the thought process of the first person to suggest this. "Sir, you're bleeding. Quick, find me a cow patty and some spiders." It's a miracle anyone survived their first aid. 19. Some knights took the concept of honor to such an extreme that they became public nuisances. A bizarre trend involved a knight taking over a bridge and refusing to let anyone pass until they jousted with him. He became a human toll booth where the price of crossing was getting hit with a giant stick. Imagine trying to get to the next town on important business, only to be stopped by some guy in a ridiculous helmet who insists on a duel just to prove how tough he is. It was less a noble defense of a pass, and more the most inconvenient and aggressive social challenge imaginable. You couldn't just pay a toll, you had to risk getting knocked into the river. 20. When you think of knightly warfare, you imagine epic clashes between armies. But a very common and approved tactic was to completely ignore the enemy soldiers and just go wage war on farmers. Known as the chevauchée, this strategy involved knights riding through the countryside, burning crops, wrecking villages, and generally making life miserable for unarmed peasants. It was less a military campaign and more a massive, destructive tantrum. The goal was to terrorize the population and ruin the enemy's economy. But it really just meant that the noblest warriors in the land spent most of their time bullying farmers and their livestock. A far cry from the chivalrous tales. 21. The call for a crusade was a powerful thing, inspiring thousands of knights to drop everything and march to the Holy Land. For some, dropping everything meant making some of the worst financial decisions in history. Knights would get so caught up in the adventurous spirit that they would sell their ancestral castles or mortgage their entire family estate for a one-way ticket to the Middle East. This was the medieval version of selling your house to fund a startup with a 99% chance of failure. They'd leave with dreams of glory and treasure, leaving their families with nothing but a pile of debt and a very empty-looking ancestral home. 22. In theory, a medieval tournament was a prestigious and orderly display of knightly skill. In reality, it was often a week-long party that spiraled into a citywide riot. With thousands of knights, squires, and hangers-on gathered in one place with a massive supply of cheap ale, things frequently got out of hand. Jousts would turn into brawls, brawls would turn into street fights, and before you knew it, the whole town was in chaos. Local residents had to board up their shops whenever a tournament came to town. It was less a sporting event and more a festival of bad decisions, property damage, and epic hangovers. 23. While knights are famous for fighting on the battlefield, some of their most intense conflicts took place in a stuffy courtroom over something incredibly petty: who was allowed to use a particular shield design. In one famous case, 2 English knights spent 5 years and an astronomical amount of money in a legal battle over a coat of arms featuring a simple blue and gold pattern. They called witnesses, hired expensive lawyers, and argued relentlessly over what was essentially a logo dispute. These were 2 of the toughest warriors in the kingdom, and they were locked in a multi-year war of paperwork and legal fees over graphic design. 24. For all their talk of honor and duty, many knights had a convenient way to get out of actually going to war. They just paid a fee. This system, called scutage or shield money, allowed a knight to give the king cash instead of showing up for military service. It was essentially a get-out-of-battle-free card. You could maintain the prestigious title of a knight, enjoy all the social benefits, and then, when a dangerous war actually started, you could just write a check and stay home. It really puts a new spin on the idea of chivalric bravery when the Code of Honor includes a section for wire transfers. 25. The diet of a wealthy knight was less about balanced nutrition and more about a relentless assault of meat and wine. Their feasts were legendary displays of excess, where vegetables were viewed with deep suspicion, and the main food groups were roasted swan, entire pigs, and gallons of alcohol. This lifestyle of non-stop feasting made them formidable on the dinner table, but less so in the long run. Many of these elite warriors who could survive a sword fight were ultimately taken down by their own forks. They suffered from gout, became too heavy for their horses, and generally ate themselves into an early grave, proving that the most dangerous battle was often the one against dessert. 26. While armor was for protection, some knights treated it like a fashion runway, adding so much gold leaf, silk, and shiny embellishments that they basically turned themselves into walking treasure chests. The idea was to look intimidating and important, but the actual result was that they became the #1 most attractive target on the battlefield. An enemy soldier would see 2 knights, one in plain, functional steel, and one who looked like a mobile jewelry store. It wasn't a hard choice. These flashy knights were practically begging to be captured for ransom, turning their own expensive sense of style into a giant, glittering bullseye. 27. Knights were expected to be pious, but they were also incredibly gullible, especially when it came to holy relics. A whole industry of con men popped up, selling knights things like splinters from the True Cross, feathers from the Archangel Gabriel's wing, or vials of the Virgin Mary's breast milk. These warriors would spend fortunes on what was usually just random bits of wood, old chicken feathers, and goat's milk. They would then carry these fake relics into battle, completely convinced they were divinely protected. It was the medieval equivalent of buying a magical healing crystal, except this one was supposed to stop a longbow arrow. 28. The Crusades were meant to be a united effort of Christian knights fighting for a common cause. However, that unity often fell apart the moment money or land was involved. It was shockingly common for Crusader lords to turn on each other, making alliances with their supposed enemies to attack fellow Christians. One day they'd be fighting alongside another Crusader army, and the next they'd be teaming up with a local Muslim emir to go conquer that same army's castle. The Holy Land became a chaotic free-for-all where alliances shifted weekly, and the only thing you could truly count on was that everyone was out for themselves. 29. A knight's helmet was designed to protect his head, but medieval fashion trends did their best to make them as impractical as possible. High-ranking knights started adding enormous sculptures called crests to the top of their helmets. These weren't small decorations, they were giant, three-dimensional models of dragons, castles, swans, or their family's entire coat of arms. Not only did this make them absurdly top-heavy and throw off their balance, but it also made them an unmissable target. It's hard to be stealthy when you have a 2-foot-tall wooden swan glued to your head. It was the peak of form over function, and it made them look both ridiculous and very easy to spot. 30. For all the dangers on the battlefield, one of the biggest threats to a knight was his own dinner plate. Wealthy nobles in the Middle Ages loved to eat from pewter dishes, which looked fancy but had a serious problem. They were loaded with lead. With every meal, and especially when acidic foods or wines were served, tiny amounts of lead would leach into their food. Over years of feasting, this slow but steady lead poisoning would take its toll, causing all sorts of health issues, including mental instability. So, the erratic and sometimes insane behavior of medieval nobles might not have just been their personality, it might have been their dinnerware. 31. While some knights lived by a code of chivalry, others used their status and their big stone castles to run what were essentially organized crime rackets. These robber barons would control key roads or bridges and extort brutal taxes and tolls from any merchant or traveler who wanted to pass. If someone refused to pay, their goods would be seized and they'd likely end up in a dungeon. These knights realized that shaking down unarmed traders was a lot easier and more profitable than actually fighting in a war. They were less like noble protectors of the realm, and more like a medieval mafia, but with better armor and a moat. 32. Knights, clad in the best armor money could buy and trained for war since childhood, were understandably confident. Sometimes they were too confident, especially when facing peasant rebels armed with farming tools. They would often mock the poorly equipped commoners, expecting an easy victory. But they frequently underestimated the sheer fury of a huge, angry mob. There are numerous accounts of overconfident knights charging into a peasant army, only to be pulled from their horses and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Being a highly trained warrior doesn't help much when you're being beaten to a pulp by 100 people wielding pitchforks, shovels, and righteous indignation. 33. A knight's honor was a fragile thing, and their egos were even more fragile. A simple insult or a perceived slight at a feast could easily escalate into a formal duel. Often, these duels were supposed to be to first blood, meaning they would stop as soon as one person was cut. But with tempers flaring and immense pressure to not look weak, these friendly contests would frequently spiral out of control. One knight would get a small cut, get angry, and retaliate with a much harder blow. Before you knew it, a squabble over who got the last piece of chicken had turned into a deadly serious fight to the finish, all because their pride got in the way. 34. In the world of medieval politics, heralds were supposed to be untouchable. They were official messengers who carried declarations of war or peace treaties, and attacking them was a major international taboo. But that didn't stop some hot-headed knights from completely losing their cool. If a herald delivered a message the knight didn't like, instead of sending a reply, he might just punch the messenger in the face. This was the ultimate diplomatic blunder, a move so disrespectful it could single-handedly derail peace talks and trigger a full-blown war, all because one knight couldn't control his temper for 5 minutes. 35. Going on a military campaign should be about traveling light and moving fast. But many high-ranking nobles and knights treated it like a luxury vacation. They wouldn't dream of leaving home without their extensive baggage train, which included fine carpets, silverware, hunting birds, and sometimes even their entire bedroom furniture set. This obsession with creature comforts turned their armies into slow, clumsy parades that were incredibly difficult to maneuver. While the enemy was making swift tactical movements, these noble knights were busy making sure their favorite tapestry hadn't gotten dusty on the march. 36. There were many prestigious knightly orders, but one of the strangest was the Order of the Swan. Yes, the bird. Founded by nobles in what is now Germany, knights of this order wore medallions shaped like swans and pledged their chivalry in honor of swans. While other orders were dedicated to holy saints or grand causes, these men were spiritually aligned with a large, aggressive water bird. You have to imagine the confusion on the battlefield. Watch out for that knight. He's a member of the fearsome order of the… Wait, is that a swan on his chest? Okay, this just got weird. 37. Building a giant wooden siege tower was a complex engineering challenge, one that required patience and skill. Unfortunately, knights were often long on ambition and short on patience. In their rush to assault a castle, some knight-led construction teams would throw together siege towers so poorly and hastily that they were structurally unsound. More than a few times, these massive towers, filled with soldiers, would groan, shudder, and then completely collapse into a heap of timber and embarrassed warriors before they even reached the enemy walls. It was the medieval equivalent of your IKEA project falling apart in your hands. 38. Today we have GPS. But back then, knights had to rely on crude maps and local guides who might not be entirely reliable. This led to the comical but deadly problem of entire armies of knights getting hopelessly lost on their way to a war. They would march in circles for weeks, run out of food, and wander aimlessly through unfamiliar forests and swamps, all while the enemy was waiting for them somewhere else entirely. Sometimes the biggest challenge for a knightly army wasn't the enemy, but just figuring out which direction they were supposed to be going in the first place. 39. While most knights served a lord, there was a special class of knight-errant who were essentially freelance heroes, wandering the countryside looking for quests. In theory, they were supposed to right wrongs and protect the innocent. In practice, many of them were just bored, heavily armed men desperately trying to pick fights to prove how chivalrous they were. They would challenge other knights for no reason, meddle in local disputes they didn't understand, and generally cause trouble wherever they went. They were less like noble saviors and more like the most annoying and dangerous tourists you could possibly imagine. 40. Early on, tournaments were not the sanitized sporting events we imagine. They were brutal, chaotic affairs where knights used their actual, real-deal sharpened lances and swords. The goal wasn't just to score points, it was to incapacitate and capture your opponent for ransom. Unsurprisingly, death and serious injury were incredibly common. The crowd absolutely loved the carnage, but it was a terrible way to lose a significant portion of your kingdom's best warriors. It was like if a modern sports league decided to play with live ammunition just to make things more exciting for the fans. 41. The idea of courtly love often involved knights performing grand deeds for a lady, who in return would give him a small token of her affection, like a silk scarf. While this was a nice romantic gesture, some knights took it way too seriously. They would ride into battle with this flimsy piece of silk tied to their arm and genuinely believe it functioned as a magical force field that could deflect arrows and sword blows. It was the ultimate triumph of romantic optimism over the harsh reality of pointy objects, and it likely did not end well for those who relied on it as their primary form of defense. 42. The medieval church had a lot of rules, and one of them was an attempt to civilize warfare by banning fighting on holy days like Sundays. This was known as the Truce of God. The knights, being pious men, would dutifully obey. They would sit around all Sunday, sharpening their swords and waiting. But as soon as the clock struck midnight and it was officially Monday, all bets were off. They would unleash all their pent-up aggression from their day off in a brutal frenzy of combat. The rule didn't actually reduce the violence, it just concentrated it into a really, really bad case of the Mondays. 43. In the heat of battle, strategic thinking can sometimes go out the window. In one infamous instance during the Crusades, a group of knights won the first phase of a battle and managed to cross a crucial bridge to pursue their fleeing enemy. Feeling supremely confident, they then made a baffling decision. They burned the bridge behind them to prevent their own men from retreating. It was a bold, no-turning-back move. Unfortunately, the enemy wasn't actually fleeing. They had just led them into a trap. An enemy relief force appeared, and the knights, with their only escape route now a pile of smoldering ashes, were completely wiped out. 44. At the Battle of the Golden Spurs, an army of elite French knights faced off against a militia of Flemish commoners. The knights, on their mighty war horses, were so confident that they saw the battle as little more than a pest control exercise. They charged, expecting to ride right over the Flemish lines. But the Flemish pikemen held their ground. The field was too marshy for a cavalry charge, and the proud French knights were pulled from their horses and utterly defeated. To add insult to injury, the victorious Flemish collected hundreds of the knights' golden spurs from the battlefield and hung them in a local church as a permanent, glittering reminder of their epic failure. So there you have it, 44 reminders that behind the legends of chivalry were real, flawed, and often hilariously misguided people. The next time you picture a noble knight, maybe also picture him getting defeated by a dog or chopping up his own shoes. History is so much better when you remember the absurd parts. Now I have to ask, if you could add one modern inconvenience to a knight's life just to make it more ridiculous, what would it be? Let the chaos begin in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into historical foolishness, be sure to vanquish that like button and subscribe for more.